Violette1st, Las Vegas Vacation. Introduction. Hello there, welcome to another Violette1st vacation story. This is the 4.0 version of my vacation series with the Anderson family. This time they are going to Las Vegas. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Mount Airy, Maryland. A 55-year-old female, Violette, is washing the dishes after she finished lunch. Soon Violette's 17-year-old son, William, surprisingly hugs Violette out of nowhere. A few seconds later Violette pats William's head. A few seconds later the mood goes dark. 3 seconds later a 58-year-old, 482-pound man, Bill, walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later Violette snaps at her husband for missing lunch. 1 second later William hisses at his wrecking ball-sized father. A few seconds later Violette says she has an announcement. A few seconds later Violette tells the boys, William and Bill, that the three of them are driving to Las Vegas to see Rick Astley perform live at Pearl Theater. A few seconds later the boys scream with excitement. A few seconds later Violette says they will be spending 34 hours in the car with only limited stops for snacks and fuel and stretch breaks and bathroom breaks. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill he will be driving the 34 hours both ways. A few seconds later Bill gulps when he knows he will be driving for nearly 3 days. In under 1 week, a few seconds later William suggests they should get suitcases. Violette then walks to the basement door. 2 minutes later Violette gives the boys 1 suitcase for each of them. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk upstairs to pack their clothes. 20 minutes later the three of them start to pack up other items. 30 minutes later Violette checks every suitcase. 5 minutes later Violette starts to load up the trunk of her SUV. 15 minutes later Bill gets into the driver's seat while carrying a duffel bag. A few minutes later Violette loads up in the third row and William loads up in the second row, both with supplies for a 1.5-day long drive. A few minutes later Bill places his duffel bag onto the passenger seat. A few seconds later Violette locks up the front door and back door. 2 minutes later Bill speeds off. 5 minutes later Violette and William walk into MAHS. A few minutes later William's headmaster, Zach, walks into his office with a folder. A few seconds later Zach gives William the week of work he would have missed because of the vacation. A few seconds later William eagerly grabs the folder. A few minutes later Bill revs the engine. A few seconds later Violette shouts to Las Vegas for better or for worse. A few seconds later Bill drives onto the streets of Mount Airy. 5 minutes later Bill drives the SUV onto a highway. A minute later William puts his headphones on. A few minutes later Violette and William lay down. A few seconds later the SUV comes to a crawl. 1 second later Bill says they are going to be in a 40-minute, 4-mile slowdown. A few seconds later Violette closes her eyeballs. 10 minutes later Violette wakes up. A few seconds later Violette sees the SUV is on the shoulder of a 8-lane interway. A few seconds later Bill says they got a flat tire. Violette then shivers with fear. A few seconds later William says a tow truck is about 10 minutes away. An hour later their tow truck finally arrives. A few minutes later Violette and William help out the tow truck operator replace the tire. 20 minutes later Violette pays $300 to the operator. 5 minutes later Bill speeds off. Half a second later the SUV stops again. Bill then sees they are out of fuel. A minute later Violette finds out the nearest gas station is 2 miles away. A few seconds later Violette forces Bill out of the SUV. A few seconds later Bill grabs 2 gas canisters. A few seconds later Bill walks to the 2-mile gas station. 4 hours later Bill finally returns via walking. A minute later Violette puts on 13 gallons of gas into the SUV. 5 minutes later Bill and his wife and son finally resume driving. 30 minutes later Bill pulls the SUV into a highway rest stop. An hour later Violette and the boys resume driving. A few seconds later the SUV runs out of fuel. A few seconds later Violette roars at Bill for not filling the gas tank up. Bill then says the gas costs $2 a gallon. 3 seconds later Violette tells Bill that he needs to push the SUV to the gas pumps. An hour later Bill drives off without his wife and son after filling up the gas tank with 40 gallons of gas. 15 minutes later Violette and William see Bill arrive back at the rest stop. 5 minutes later the Anderson family speed off bound for Vegas. Exactly 6 hours later Bill pulls into a Walmart parking lot for the night. 1 hour later the family falls asleep in the SUV. 5 hours later Violette wakes up at the crack of dawn. 3 seconds later William wakes up. 10 minutes later Bill wakes up. An hour later Bill turns the SUV on. 5 minutes later the SUV speeds onto a highway. 20 minutes later the SUV runs over a butter knife. A few seconds later the front right tire explodes. A minute later Violette gets out of the SUV to inspect the damages. A few seconds later Violette sees an exploded tire trail. A few seconds later Violette calls another tow truck company. 10 minutes later Violette ends the call. 30 minutes later a tow truck finally arrives with a spare tire. A few minutes later Violette pays the tow truck operator $180. 5 minutes later Bill speeds off without his wife. 1 hour later Bill parks the SUV next to an angry Violette. 2 minutes later the three of them speed off to Las Vegas. 2 hours later Bill parks the car in a highway rest stop. A few seconds later Bill walks into a McDonald's. 20 minutes later Bill gets back into the SUV with a bag containing 7 Big Macs. 5 minutes later Bill resumes driving on the same highway. 6 minutes later Violette watches her SUV come to a complete stop on the shoulder of a 6-lane expressway. A few seconds later Bill says they ran out of gasoline again. Violette then realizes she has signed up for many days of slow driving. A few seconds later Violette opens a map app on her iPhone. 20 seconds later Violette sees the nearest gas station is 5 miles away. A few seconds later Violette gives Bill 4 gas canisters. A minute later Bill walks on the side of the expressway towards the gas station that is 26,400 feet away. 8 hours later Bill finally arrives back at the SUV. 5 minutes later Bill resumes driving towards the hotel in Las Vegas. 5 minutes later Violette puts in 50 gallons of fuel into the SUV and gas canisters. 2 minutes later Bill drives onto a 4-lane highway. 2 hours later Bill parks the SUV in a shopping mall parking lot. An hour later the family fall asleep. 9 hours later, Bill drives the SUV onto a 400-mile long road. A few seconds later, Bill speeds up to 80 miles per hour. 5 hours later, Bill arrives at the end of the road as he slams the brakes to Violette's SUV. 10 minutes later, Bill pulls into a Wendy's parking lot for lunch. 37 minutes later, Bill finishes eating his 4th T-Rex burger. 5 minutes later, Bill drives the SUV onto a highway. 2 hours later, Violette grabs some cheeseburgers for dinner. 10 minutes later, Violette and William finish eating their cheeseburgers. 20 minutes later, Bill parks the SUV on the shoulder of a highway for the night. 2 hours later, Violette and the boys head to bed. 6 hours later, Violette wakes up the boys at the crack of dawn. 1 hour later, Bill continues driving. 3 minutes later, Bill drives the SUV onto an off-ramp, ignoring the GPS directions. An hour later, Bill drives back onto the highway after wasting 48 minutes. 5 minutes later, Bill says they are almost out of fuel again. 6 seconds later, the SUV slows down on the side of a 9-lane interway. 5 minutes later, Bill starts a 1-mile walk towards the nearest gas station. 3.5 hours later, Bill puts 10 gallons of gasoline into the gas tank. 2 minutes later, Bill speeds away with Violette and William in the SUV this time. 10 hours later, Violette says they are done driving for the day. 5 seconds later, Bill parks Violette's SUV on the shoulder of a 12-lane interway. An hour later, everyone heads to bed. 6 hours later, Violette wakes up. 20 minutes later, Bill resumes driving after chugging a gallon of barbecue sauce. 2 hours later, Bill sees smoke leaking out of the engine hood. 2 minutes later, the SUV comes to a screeching halt on an off-ramp that is connected to 2 interstate highways. 5 hours later, Bill resumes driving after a $8,000 tow truck ticket. 3 hours later, Violette says they are sleeping. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys fall asleep. 8 hours later, Violette wakes up. 18 minutes later, Violette says they will not be stopping until the hotel. 4 seconds later, Bill drives towards the hotel. 4 hours and 15 minutes later, they finally arrive at their hotel in Las Vegas after 100 hours and 3 minutes of painful car travel. 5 minutes later, Violette check into the hotel for their room. 10 minutes later, they unpack. 20 minutes later, Bill suggests they should visit the Heart Attack Grill for lunch before the Rick Astley concert. Violette unwillingly agrees. 20 minutes later, the family arrive at the weigh-in. A minute later, Bill gets weighed. A few seconds later, the scale says Bill weighs 564 pounds. A few seconds later, a worker says that Bill can eat for free. Violette then gulps with fear. 10 minutes later, Violette and William each order a hot dog. A few seconds later, Bill orders 20 octuple bypass burgers. 2 seconds later, Violette roars at Bill for getting 130 pounds of food. An hour later, Bill starts shoving fistfuls of Heart Attack down his throat. 10 minutes later, Bill gets stuffed after eating 82 pounds of food. 2 hours later, Violette and the boys sit down at their seats, waiting for Rick Astley's concert. 10 minutes later, Bill starts throwing popcorn off his seat and onto random concert goers. 5 minutes later, Violette and the boys get thrown out of the concert. A few seconds later, Violette and the boys speed back to their hotel. 20 minutes later, the hotel owner arrives at the SUV when it's parking. 2 minutes later, Violette is told her family is kicked out for exploding the deck. A few seconds later, Bill admits to what he did. 2 minutes later, Violette and William ask if they can get their belongings before they leave. Then they get permission. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys drive off to a restaurant for supper that Violette reserved 8 months in advance. An hour later, they arrive at the Mayfair Supper Club. 20 minutes later, Violette and the boys order their entrees. A few seconds later, Bill sees a famous person. 10 seconds later, Violette watches Bill slap the face of Rick Rubin. 10 minutes later, the mayor of LA bans Violette and the boys from entering the city ever again. A few minutes later, Violette and the boys get onto a highway. 5 minutes later, Bill turns onto an off-ramp. A few seconds later, Bill stops the SUV at the end of a 40-mile traffic jam. 3 hours later, Bill sees they have only moved 4 minutes down the road. A few seconds later, Violette says that there is a major tractor-trailer rollover and 12-car pile-up 38 miles ahead of them, with all lanes closed and all traffic is converging onto a 1-lane off-ramp. Bill then screams with all his might. A few seconds later, Bill pulls onto the shoulder of the highway. An hour later, they all head to sleep. 6 hours later, Bill wakes up at the crack of dawn. A few seconds later, Bill sees the traffic jam is gone and all. An hour later, they all head to sleep. 6 hours later, Bill wakes up at the crack of dawn. A few seconds later, Bill sees the traffic jam is gone and all lanes are reopened on his map app. 10 minutes later, Bill resumes driving. 3 hours later, Bill pulls over to the side of a highway. An hour later, the family resumed driving after a rest and stretch break. 15 minutes later, Bill hears squealing. A few seconds later, Bill drives the SUV into a ditch. 2 seconds later, a tire explodes. An hour later, Violette sees a tow truck they called arrive at the crashed SUV. 2 hours later, Violette pays people $8,000 for everything. 10 minutes later, Bill resumes driving. A few seconds later, Violette says they will not be stopping until it becomes nightfall. Bill then sighs. 8.5 hours later, Bill pulls into a Walmart parking lot. 10 minutes later, the family heads to sleep. 8 hours later, the family wakes up. 1 hour later, Bill drives onto a highway. 3 hours later, Violette tells Bill to pull into the closest Burger King drive-thru for lunch. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys each order something small. 20 minutes later, they resume driving on a highway. 9 hours later, Violette says they are sleeping for the night, then finishing the 14-hour and 23-minute drive in the morning with no breaks. 10 minutes later, the family falls asleep. 6 hours later, Violette and the boys wake up. 20 minutes later, they start their massive day-long drive. 15 hours later, Violette and the boys arrive home after 1 week of painful car travel. A few seconds later, Violette and the boys walk into the house. 10 minutes later, they finish unpacking. A few seconds later, Violette tells Bill he is getting a brutal life-threatening punishment day. Bill gulps with fear. 1 second later, Violette says there will be 12 punishments that will start out painless and get more painful and destructive as they go on. Bill screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later, Bill is dragged into the house against his will. 2 minutes later, Violette says the punishments. Violette says the first punishment is that your blanket will be ripped apart. Punishment 2 is an arm slap. Third punishment will be an Xbox fire. Punishment 4 is a downstairs region kick. 5th is a TV fire. 6 is a BB gun to the behind. 7 is a dry ice and liquid nitrogen bath. 8 you will be driven over with my Ferrari at 100 miles per hour. 9 you will be forced to hug a cactus. 10 you will be thrown into a pit of black widow spiders. 11. 10 you will be thrown into a pit of black widow spiders. 11 is you be cliffed. Finally, punishment 12 is you will be launched into space with no spacesuit. Bill screams with pure anger. 3 seconds later Violette rips Bill's blanket in half. A few seconds later Violette slaps Bill while grabbing his Xbox. A few seconds later Violette walks downstairs with the Xbox. A few seconds later Violette grabs a flamethrower. 1 minute later the Xbox is put up in flames. A few seconds later Violette kicks Bill's nether region with all her might. 1 second later Bill crashes onto asphalt. 2 minutes later Bill's bedroom TV is ablaze. A few seconds later Violette shoots Bill's rear end with her BB gun. 1 minute later Violette starts setting up Bill's bath. 10 minutes later Bill gets pushed into the bathtub. 5 minutes later Violette drags Bill outside against his will. A few minutes later Violette runs over Bill at over 120 miles per hour. A few seconds later Bill crashes onto the roof of the house. 2 minutes later Bill and Violette drive off to a desert. 10 minutes later Bill hugs a cactus. A few minutes later they drive off to Florida. An hour later they arrive at the tallest cliff in Vermont for punishment 11. A few minutes later Violette and Bill are flown up to the peak. A few minutes later Bill is thrown off the peak of the cliff. 5 minutes later Bill and Violette drive off to Florida. 18 hours later Violette and Bill arrive at the Everglades. An hour later Bill is thrown into a pit of black widows. A few minutes later Violette and Bill speed off to NASA's John F. Kennedy Space Center. 20 minutes later Violette parks the Ferrari. A few minutes later Violette is fitted for a spacesuit. An hour later the shuttle is ready. A few minutes later Bill and Violette board the shuttle with Shannon Walker and Andrew R. Morgan. An hour later the shuttle blasts off. 20 minutes later Bill is thrown out of the shuttle with a spacesuit. A few minutes later Bill's spacesuit helmet visor remotely opens. Half a second later Bill explodes and ceases to exist. A few hours later the shuttle lands and is broadcasted nationwide. The end.